for now, it's up to the states to determine whether women can get reproductive health care.
The rights of millions of women across this country are now falling on the shoulders of just a handful of states. Just a handful of states are now going to have to take care of the health care of women from other states.
We are, in fact, that brick wall against this horrific Supreme Court decision.
Welcome back. Those are three of the Democratic governors who met virtually today with President Biden earlier, talking about how it's up to the states to take the baton on abortion access now. Joining me now is another participant from that governor's meeting with President Biden. It's Washington State's Governor Jay Inslee. Governor Inslee, happy 4th, and thank you for being here.
Thank you. Happy 4th to you.
Let me start with, look, I know what all of the governors are attempting to do, and there's a lot of those governors that were in that meeting, yourself included, who have initiated some things already to deal with, whether it's folks coming from another state where it's going to be banned, et cetera. But I'm curious, what can you tell me? What did President Biden say they could do? Because it doesn't sound like we're hearing a lot.
Oh, no, I disagree with you. I think the President Biden can do some very important things, and I believe he will do some important things. And we talked about how to basically assist the states that want to be sanctuary states. So my state intends to be fully a sanctuary state. We believe we have a responsibility to our fellow citizens in other states who have Republican politicians to decide to dictate this most private right to their citizens, and we intend to be a sanctuary state to support them. So there are many things the federal government can do, and we talked about those today. Number one, I encourage the president to essentially have an executive order to prohibit federal law enforcement agencies, FBI, Homeland Security, and the like, from giving their databases or their assets to local states who try to impinge and put their tentacles into my state to prosecute individual women and try to put them in jail. He expressed an interest in that. We hope that he can jawbone with the network providers and the like to make sure that they protect the data of women, very private information, so that these platforms don't give this information to these prosecutors who want to put their citizens in jail if they do exercise abortion services in our states. And third, and I think most important, we talked to him about the both efficacy, safety, and efficiency of pharmaceutical abortion. And that means basically that we can use telemedicine to appropriately prescribe these pharmaceutical products. People not even have to travel thousands of miles, and then make sure that the FDA law is respected. These are FDA-approved products, and that the states don't try to override the federal government FDA approval of these products as safe, efficient products. He expressed an interest and is looking at measures to do that as well. So there's a lot of things that the administration can do, and I believe they will. We obviously appreciate his stepping up to the plate and asking for repeal at least a portion of our filibuster rules. So we felt good about this call. I felt good that he is committed to taking some major steps here.
The telemedicine,
as well, by the way, of helping us financially,
right?
Because we
I was just going to say,
these women pay for it.
The telemedicine idea is fascinating. I think we're all curious to see if that could be implemented. What do you need from the federal government? So the idea is this: if somebody in Boise, somebody in Idaho doesn't want to have to travel over state, they can get prescribed this from a doctor in Washington State via telemedicine. And you believe, what does the federal government need to do to protect that person's ability to get the proper medication?
Two things. We need the administration to issue a statement that they consider the FDA rules to preempt state rules in this regard, and that the FDA decisions will be respected, and that the federal government will take that position. And the FDA rules are in place. They do preempt states to some degree in this regard, and simply announcing that the federal government will take that position. And second, either initiate or stand by in litigation to enforce those rules against these rogue Republican politicians who want to intrude to overpower the private decisions by their constituents. And by the way, I do think it's important in this. I don't want to leave this conversation by saying this. Look, what we are experiencing here is a Republican effort to impose minority decisions in a democracy where the majority should be making these decisions. The majority of Americans want gun safety. A majority want climate change, and huge majorities want to protect the right of choice, even in states, in red states. This is what the people want. So basically saying that the federal government is going to enforce that, the majority will of Americans, is the right thing to do. And the president said that he is now assessing the right measures to take to assure that these FDA-approved drugs, in fact, can be available to all Americans.
You have a compact with California and Oregon on abortion rights. What does that mean in practice?
Well, it has two important things. One, we're going to collaborate in looking at ideas. We share technology. We share political confidence that we're all going to be in this together. We share a message to American women that the West Coast is available to help them assure this right. So in part, our compact is to make sure women across America know that we stand by to protect them. And we have found we're doing this on climate change as well. So the West Coast is a beacon of advanced thought, and not even advanced thought, just protecting what we have in this country, which is the right of choice, the right to breathe clean air and not be destroyed by climate change. The West Coast has been effective in working together.
What did the president say? I know that particularly a couple other governors brought up the idea of, is there something that can be done on federal lands in states that ban abortion? Whether it's a private enterprise that works with a tribe to open up a clinic. I know that federal funds can't be used. What did the president say about that? Does he not want to pursue that strategy?
I don't know. He certainly didn't say anything dispositive. When I brought up this issue of pharmaceutical abortions, and I suggested maybe delivery could be taken by women on federal property, for instance, he said that shouldn't be necessary, right? He brought up this issue that the FDA has already ruled these are safe products for women, and the federal law already makes this available, and we got to make sure that that preempts the wrong-headed attempt of these states. He thought that was more efficient to just do direct delivery through the U.S. mails of a federal drug administration that clearly has been given the authority. And the Supreme Court isn't going to be able to get rid of this one, calling it a major decision. They clearly have authority to do this, and I think we are in good grounds to maintain that. So I think it sounded like the president was more interested in that delivery model, and I'll back him up 100%. We really appreciate his leadership on this.
Last question I'm going to get you out on a different topic. Is there any role for you or the state government to play in protecting the University of Washington and Washington State? The economies in both places could get hit hard if essentially the Pac-12 is not what it used to be, if they're not a part of the Bay. Are you worried about that financially, and is there a role for the state to play?
Well, I'm glad we have pivoted from the existential threat of climate change, which might destroy life as we know it, to college football. So I'm glad we're doing that. But there may be some role. I haven't explored it seriously. We're more focused on some of these other issues right now. And I think we should look at it through a prism of the athlete's experience, the student's experience, what's good for them. I don't think we should evaluating this about what's good about the bottom line of universities or private, even media empires, with all due respect. We should be focused on the experience of students and young people. And frankly, if I can just a moment say somewhat just tiny controversial, I think it's kind of sad that we've lost focus of what athletics are about. Athletics ought to be about people having fun and having, a good experience with their friends and adventure, rather than turning this in factories and profit centers for colleges. I think that has distorted athletics a little bit. And I'd like to get back to the way it was when my dad was a coach, where kids could play multiple sports and they weren't turned into little profit centers to look for franchise deals. I'm looking to get back to the good old days.
If I could say here. I think that's the concern a lot have. And, oh, by the way, these are state tax dollars that we're also talking about in all these places. Anyway, Governor Inslee, you are not wrong. We got a lot of problems on our hands. College football, small potatoes, no doubt. But I have a feeling your inbox is going to get a lot of stuff anyway. Thank you, sir.
I think that's true.
Yeah. Coming up.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.